Okay. Hi, everyone. So, first of all, I want to say hi to everybody in the Bronx office and also to everybody who's watching online. I know there's been a lot of kind of speculation as to what I am going to do next and what my intention is. I want to let people know that my intention is that we are not going to stop fighting. And what that will manifest itself in, whether that's me running again, which I kind of said last week, yes, Vega 26. Yeah, we are intending to continue to go. But more importantly, we are setting out to do something with this campaign that we wanted it to always be. Towards the end of Vega 24, we saw ourselves mobilizing by getting people like Scott Ritter and Larry Wilkerson assembled with other people like Dennis Fritz, Jimmy Dore, Due Dissidents, Garland Nixon, and others for an indoor peace rally. That was something our campaign was able to do. We were able to rapidly move to get Dr. Mark Perlmutter a venue and an audience, people who wanted to come and hear him speak after he was canceled at Mount Sinai. What we intend to do with this campaign is to revive intellectual thought and capacity in not just the Bronx, but around the country as a whole. I don't know of any other congressional campaigns that are committed to doing exactly that, hosting weekly classes like what we've been doing in the Bronx, or even hosting kind of seminars, building for stuff like the International Peace Coalition call, doing what we're doing on Monday nights, where we have people from around the country who are organizers, activists come on and listen to what we're doing and give reports on what they're doing as well. So we intend to continue to do that, as well as having a stronger social media presence as well, building and creating content that is more polished and refined, full of quality that people can use in their organizing every day. I'm only excited for what's actually coming next, and I think you should be too. And I think these next few days will show exactly what I mean, and I would be excited if I were you. 2025 will probably be more important than whatever discussions about 2026 will come. And if you want to be involved in that, go to votevega.nyc, follow me on Twitter, reach out to me personally, or contact any of our organizers. We would be more than happy to get you started and get you situated on what we're intending to do and what we're planning on doing. And all I can say is it also begins with a discussion tonight on Edgar Poe. I believe the topic is going to be on the pit and the pendulum. And I won't say more, I won't spoil it. All I can say is I hope you enjoy the class tonight, which will be led by Dennis Speed. And I'll just pass it off to you, Dennis.
Reading The Pit and the Pendulum, which is a story by Edgar Poe. But we will be reading that story in the context of a discussion that has now become timely because of the change in the United States, the impending change that could occur, not really as a result of the election as much as a result of the response to the election, potential response to the election. The electoral cycle of the present presidency, or the incoming president, will take us over the years 2025, January 20th, 2025, through January 20th, 2029. So that's going to be, that happens to intersect as a cycle, a broader historical cycle. And that one is the 250th birthday of the founding of the United States as a United States of America. It's really the second American Revolution after the revolution that had occurred of 1630 through 1690. That was primarily located only in Massachusetts, and is not, of course, the United States. That's one part of America. The revolution, the American Revolution, the first battle of it, official battle, was the Battle of Lexington and Concord, and that was on the 19th of April of 1775. So April 19th of 2025 would be the 250th anniversary of that actual engagement of hostilities between the British forces and the Americans. a guerrilla force of Americans, a volunteer force of Americans that ultimately was turned into an army over the course of that next period of time. So, okay, so the present presidential cycle intersects that larger cycle, 250 years, which is a quarter of a millennium. It's sometimes called the sesquicentennial. So this is going to give people an opportunity to revisit what the actual identity and purpose of the United States is. In that context, we're going to be talking about the poet and thinker Edgar Poe. And in specific, I'll be referring, in effect, to the work of a friend of mine, now deceased, Alan Salisbury, who did the work on Edgar Poe. And Lynn, if you could just give me the other book that I want to use, that the Civil War book. He was not merely a political activist, but he was a thinker. And he wrote a book called The Civil War and the American System, America's Battle with Britain, 1860 to 1876. At the time the book was written, which was during the period just after the bicentennial of 1976, during the Carter administration, the research that was done for the book, which involved a research team, a lot of people who was working on it at the time. I was one of the people working on it, but there were many people. Was we were writing a series of books about the United States. One was the Political Economy of the American Revolution, and that was a book of the writings of Hamilton and others, but it was also really a study of the precursors to the American Revolution. And various authors, Nancy Spanish, Chris White, several other people were involved in that book. There's another historian, now also deceased, Graham Lowry, who wrote a book called How the Nation Was Won, that he did studies. Alan was doing a study of, and the rediscovery of something called the American System. And notably, for the purposes of our talk tonight, and what he had to say about Poe, we started out trying to primarily investigate at that time the relationship between the European, particularly German, interaction with America around the time of the so-called American Civil War, more correctly referred to as the War of the Southern Secession, because actually Lincoln never recognized the Southern states as being legitimate. He always recognized them as having seceded from the United States, and emphasized that there was only one nation, and there was not some other power which was ever, in his view, recognized as an opposition power. It was always only recognized as a series of states in revolt. I reference that because it's important from the standpoint of the idea of what we'll be talking about a bit tonight, which is metaphor, that the United States is both a metaphor, but more importantly, it is a singular entity. There are 50 states that comprise something called the United States, but the United States is not those 50 states. The United States is a singular entity, and the states are derivative of the single entity, the United States. That was what Lincoln was fighting his second, in that sense, American Revolution about. And that's what distinguished Lincoln, and also Frederick Douglass, I might add, from particularly the abolitionists, which they were not, and of course the secessionists, which they also were not. Sort of important because it's like talking about the problem of the crisis of democracy in the United States. But the United States is not a democracy. The United States is a republic. If the United States were a democracy, it would never survive its present circumstances, just as Athenian democracy did not survive. Actually, then again, Plato and Socrates fought for an Athenian republic. Athens, of course, was a city-state. It was never actually the case that Greece as such was a single nation. So it's not, the analogy is not perfect between the United States and Greece, but I just want to make the point as a way of starting out our discussion of tonight, because the issue that Poe, the poet Poe, is dealing with is the attempt to create a kind of national identity for the United States, as opposed to the imperial identity that the United States seceded from, that of Britain. One of the things that what we might look to do, in fact, hopefully do, is to end the concept of a special relationship with Great Britain. That might be in the offing now that with the transition team that Trump is beginning to announce, there's a lot of reverberations which may in fact allow the idea of destroying that special relationship or ending it, we can call it that, to come back into the fore by defining why the United States is a republic. It is not an empire, as is and that's a term used by various people, many of them well-meaning, about the United States. The United States is not an empire. It may have been the case that there are policies which are imperialist and there are policies which are colonialist, which are being carried out in the name of the United States by various people who have usurped the government of the United States. That may be true. The United States, in its structure and in its function as a nation, cannot be an empire. Let me repeat that. It cannot be an empire. And therefore, some of the discussion around the issue of Tulsi Gabbard as director of national intelligence becomes interesting. For example, let's pose an hypothesis. Let's say that there has not actually been a United States which has been itself since September 11th of 2001. I'm not going to contend or assert at this point that that is the case, but what if that were the case? What if it were the case that from the time of the actions that were taken at the time of the 9/11 attacks, that as one Russian economist has asserted, Sergei Glaziev, that the intelligence forces, Western intelligence forces, carried out that attack. Now, if that were true, and if it were to be determined that it were true, then what you'd also have to conclude is that everything that is popularly thought in the United States about that attack is false. And in fact, all of the actions taken by the United States government or institutions associated with the United States government were taken under false pretenses. So what would that mean about the United States Congress or the United States presidency from that period? What is it the case, or what might it be the case, that you have not had a free United States since September 11th? What if it were the case that intelligence agencies in collusion here, both in the United States and other intelligence agencies, let's say NATO-based intelligence agencies, had in fact conducted an attack on the United States, blaming it on assets which they themselves created, and then proceeded to launch a series of unlawful criminal wars around the planet? Now, if you wanted to say, or I'll indicate, if you want to say that action being taken by a United States in which a coup was made by dint of an attack on the United States, well, then, of course, the United States would not have attacked itself. Some set of forces would have attacked the United States. They might be contained within the United States. They might be in the Pentagon, they might be in the State Department, but to call that the United States would not be correct. Because that's an attack on the principles of the Republic of the United States. And it's done in secret, and it's done without any acknowledgement to this day. Now, what if the Director of National Intelligence, in the course of releasing or investigating or examining various files and other materials, found that that could be, in fact, demonstrated to the people of the United States? So, maybe what's actually being discussed around the issue of Tulsi Gabbard, who, after all, is a veteran, a combat veteran, in fact, I believe, United States, and has served as a congresswoman, and is now being accused by various people who did not do that, did not serve in the military, as being in the pocket of Vladimir Putin. What if she, along with other patriotic forces, many of them, by the way, retired, persons such as Ray McGovern or William Binney from the National Security Agency or Larry Johnson from Central Intelligence or other people, were allowed to be given an audience which, in fact, exposed that the entire last quarter century, pretty much, of American actions have occurred without the authorization of the American people for any of those actions, and they have occurred unlawfully. Now, what do we do to investigate, or how could we do an investigation that would allow us to determine that? I'm looking for something, I just have to find it here, excuse me, where Edgar Poe, I think some people are aware of this, some people may not know, that there is a case that Edgar Poe investigated in New York when he lived in New York. He lived, by the way, in the Bronx. We sometimes just point that out at the beginning of each class. And this was in 1842, which is about the time when the story, The Pit and the Pendulum, is written, same time. Poe wrote a letter to a friend of his in 1842. He's 33 years old at this point. And he's describing a story he had just written. And he says it's going to be a sequel to another story. He says, I am just now putting the concluding touch to an article which I shall entitle The Mystery of Marie Roget, a sequel to The Murders in the Rue Morgue. That was an earlier story he had written. He said, the story is based upon that of the real murder of Mary Cecilia Rogers, which created so vast an excitement some months ago in New York. I have handled the design in a very singular and entirely novel manner. I imagine a series of nearly exact coincidences occurring in Paris. So what he's saying is he's changing it from New York to Paris. A young woman, one Marie Roget, has been murdered under precisely similar circumstances with Mary Rogers. Thus, under a pretense of showing how Dupin, the hero of the Rue Morgue, unraveled the mystery of Marie's assassination, I, in fact, enter into a rigorous analysis of the real tragedy in New York. My main object, however, as you will readily understand, is the analysis of the principles of investigation in cases of like character. And he puts principles of investigation in italics. So he wants it to be clear that what he did with his analysis of the Mary Rogers murder, which, by the way, he solved, was done because he was trying to understand what were the principles of investigating any murder or any such mystery. Okay, so the study we're trying to do here, in general, I mean, at least in terms of reading Poe, Okay, because a lot of what we're really doing in these classes, let's be straightforward, is we're reading it and we're introducing people who may not have had an introduction to it, to Edgar Poe. But we're doing this from a very particular standpoint. We have argued in each of our classes, and I'm not going to talk a lot about this tonight, but that Poe was part of an intelligence service which involved James Fenimore Cooper, Samuel Morse, Alexander Dumas of Paris, the Marquis de Lafayette of France, and many others. And that he is asserted by the author, Alexander Dumas, to have been part of a group of a small number of people, of Americans, that had worked in Europe, particularly in the case of Poland, and also to some degree in France, as part of such a secret intelligence service. Dumas says that he was introduced to Edgar Poe, or Edgar Poe introduced himself to Dumas with a letter from James Fenimore Cooper. And we're not going to talk a lot about this right now, but let's just put it this way. The Americans had formed, prior to the American Revolution of 1776, an informal intelligence capability. This was later made formal during the time of Washington's creation of his army. And some people who are here know a little bit about this. John Jay, Hamilton, and others were the center of that apparatus. And that apparatus, after the revolution, which ended in 1783, was continued. And Ben Franklin had been basically the titular head of it prior to the revolution. But after the revolution, Washington and the Marquis de Lafayette were the heads of it. Washington for the United States, and the Marquis de Lafayette for Europe. So there was a need to continue the generations of this, and Poe was one of the people that became part of that intelligence service. One of the most important things that they sought to do was to begin to create a new culture, an American culture. But an American culture meant something very different than you would think about it today, I think, because remember that the American Revolution is an international affair. The people from France, from Germany, from Poland, and it includes, by the way, also, importantly, either portions of the enslaved African population of the United States, as well as the free African population of the United States. So everybody's in it. And so it's a completely different thing than it would appear to be. So I want to now go, because we're going to get right to the story, but I want to just introduce one thing. There's a paper by Alan Salisbury. I gave out copies here, and there's a section called The Poetry of Politics. And I would request this. Just read for me kind of just the first two paragraphs there.
Should I go up?
Well, do you need to get up to do it? Well, you have somebody else here to get up to do it. You should get there.
Do I put this in?
Does that work for you?
Yeah.
Okay. I didn't realize you wouldn't have done that.
Yeah. By the time Poe entered on the American literary scene, it was infested with a mad variety of sects and cults. Transcendentalists, Carlylists, Knickerbockers, Fourierists, and spiritualists were crawling all over the place. Poe assessed the situation in his very first editorial statement for the Southern Literary Messenger. When shall the artist assume his proper station in society? How long shall the various vermin of the earth, who crawl around the altar of Mammon, be more esteemed of men than they, the gifted ministers to those exalted emotions which link us to the mysteries of heaven? To our own query we may venture a reply. Not long. A spirit is already abroad at war with it. Poe's proper and most urgent concern, among his other duties, was to reestablish the universal rules of Platonic poetic composition, which had earlier been the root of American culture. It was because of his efforts to accomplish this that he incurred the wrath of the literary charlatans and still angers them today. Poe's warning that this literary conspiracy was destroying the very soul of America was the subject of many of his tales, including Milanta Tauta, from which I quote a relevant passage.
Okay, so we're going to stop right there for a moment, okay? That's okay. So now, as you hear, at least the contention of Alan Salisbury is that Poe's tales are actually part of a literary war that he's doing on behalf of the creation of an American culture over against a series of very weird activities that are happening in the United States of his period. This is the United States in the aftermath of John Quincy Adams having been president from 1824 to 1828 and then being defeated and Andrew Jackson taking over the presidency. Poe begins, well, he's already had a literary career in one sense by the time he's 13 years old. That's in 1822, but in terms of being, let's say, being published, it's about 1832 is when his first stories are beginning to come out. But I want to refer, we said we were going to talk about The Pit and the Pendulum. So The Pit and the Pendulum is a story written by Poe in 1842. And it's a well-known story. It's been a lot of things have been done to it. You can get a lot of badly read versions of it. We're going to go through it tonight. And what I want to start by saying is that this is one of the stories, there's about 4 or 5 Poe stories that have become the core of horror movies, etc. This is one of them. Never will you see, and never do you hear in any of the readings that I'm aware of, the actual beginning of the story. There may be one that you may find. If somebody finds one, let me know, because it begins with a Latin quatrain. And I will read you. There are 2 different translations. So it says, Impia tantorum longus hic turba furores, sanguinis innocui non satia aluit. Sospite nunc patria fracto nunc funeris antro, mors ubi dira fuit, vita solusque patent. So here it is in 2 different translations. Here the wicked mob, unappeased, long cherished a hatred of innocent blood. Now that the fatherland is saved and the cave of death demolished, where grim death had been, life and health appear. I'll read you a second translation, very close, but it is different. The unholy gang of torturers fed its long furies from the blood of the innocent and was not satisfied. Now that the fatherland is safe, the cave of death is broken. Where terrible death was, life and health appear. And it says further, this is a quatrain composed for the gates of a market to be erected upon the site of the Jacobin clubhouse at Paris. So this is written by Poe, and it is composed, as he said, and this was not done, but this is something that he is proposing. Now, the Jacobins, as I think people are aware, are often referred to this day, by the way, in France and other places, as the great revolutionary force of the French Revolution. And it was this force to which people like Thomas Jefferson and even Tom Paine, in a different way, wanted to pledge allegiance. They thought that the United States should involve itself in the French Revolution on the side of the Jacobins. But Alexander Hamilton did not think that, and Gouverneur Morris did not think that, Gouverneur Morris of Morrisania and the Bronx. nor did George Washington, nor did Ben Franklin. Because they recognized that the Jacobins represented, and later this would become inevitably clear to people in the form of the Terror, a force which was not like that of the American Revolution. It was a force that was also, by the way, being fomented and financed also by British intelligence. A little bit later, actually, James Fenimore Cooper, contended that it was being done through the British Secret Intelligence Services. And the Americans, including Poe, spent quite a bit of time fighting against what is the Scottish branch, the Edinburgh branch of the British Secret Intelligence Services. Now, I'm not tonight going to go through the particulars of that history. Alan Salisbury, by the way, does go through that history in his article. So it's in the beginning of the article, and you can access it, and we can leave a link or something because people can actually get it, so that way people can read it. But for our purposes, I want to just make sure we start that beginning of the story. Now, I'm going to begin to ask people to read, so I'd like people to get prepared to read. I'll start us off, and let me give the setting of the story. Now, the setting of the story is the Inquisition, and if you read various academic nerds, they will explain to you, well, wait a minute, this is not really right, because Poe is talking about the Inquisition, but really the Inquisition was earlier, but he also seems to be setting this at a certain time, in the 19th century, during the Peninsular Wars in Spain. They just do all this, right? Well, of course, it's all a metaphor. It doesn't all match. It's not supposed to all match. But I want to just say that what we're going to be coming into is a scene in which someone has just been accused of a crime that we don't know anything about. And the Inquisition was, for people that don't have a sense of how it worked, it was ostensibly a protection of the Catholic faith, and had been very formidable, and was known for its methods of torture. This was true for many centuries. The kind of thing that they would do, just to have a sense of what the Inquisition was like, is that if you wanted to prove that a woman was not a witch, what you would do is you would boil her in oil. And if she didn't die, she was a witch. That's the sort of thing that the Inquisition came up with. So that's sort of the background setting for what we're dealing with. So I'm gonna start, and I'd like to just who would want to read after me?
Is that a copy as well?
Yeah, that is a copy.
Can we use that?
Yeah, sure. You can take that one. Please take that. And just have to look at the story. I was in the back. Okay, so I'm just going to start us off. I was sick unto death with that long agony, and when they at length unbound me, and I was permitted to sit, I felt that my senses were leaving me. The sentence, the dread sentence of death, was the last of distinct accentuation which reached my ears. After that, the sound of the inquisitorial voices seemed merged in one dreamy, indeterminate hum. It conveyed to my soul the idea of revolution, perhaps from its association in fancy with the burr of a mill wheel. This only for a brief period, for presently I heard no more. Yet for a while I saw, but with how terrible an exaggeration, I saw the lips of the black-robed judges. They appeared to me white, whiter than the sheet upon which I traced these words, and thin, even to grotesqueness, thin with the intensity of their expression of firmness, of immovable resolution, of stern contempt of human torture. I saw that the decrees of what to me was fate were still issuing from those lips. I saw them writhe with a deadly locution. I saw them fashion the syllables of my name, and I shuddered because no sound succeeded. I saw too for a few moments of delirious horror, the soft and nearly imperceptible waving of the sable draperies which enwrapped the walls of the apartment. And then my vision fell upon the 7 tall candles upon the table. At first, they wore the aspect of charity and seemed white, slender angels who would save me. But then, all at once, there came a most deadly nausea over my spirit, and I felt every fiber in my frame thrill, as if I had touched the wire of a galvanic battery, while the angel forms became meaningless specters with heads of flame, and I saw that from them there would be no help. And there stole into my fancy, like a rich musical note, the thought of what sweet rest there must be in the grave. The thought came gently and stealthily, and it seemed long before it attained full appreciation. But just as my spirit came at length properly to feel and entertain it, the figures of the judges vanished, as if magically, from before me. The tall candles sank into nothingness. Their flames went out utterly. The blackness of darkness supervened. All sensation appeared swallowed up in that mad, rushing descent, as of the soul into Hades. Then silence and stillness and night were the universe. I had swooned, but will not say that all of consciousness was lost. What of it there remained, I will not attempt to define or even to describe, yet all was not lost. In the deepest slumber, no. In delirium, no. In a swoon, no. In death, no. Even in the grave, all is not lost, else there is no immortality for man. Arousing from the most profound of slumbers, we break the gossamer web of some dream. Yet in a second afterwards, so frail may that web have been, we remember not that we have dreamed. In the return to life from the swoon, there are 2 stages. First, that of the sense of mental or spiritual. Secondly, that of the sense of physical existence. It seems preferable that if, upon reaching the second stage, we would recall the impressions of the first, we should find these impressions eloquent in memories of the gulf beyond. And that gulf is what? How at least shall we distinguish its shadows from those of the tomb? But if the impressions of what I have termed the first stage are not at will recalled, yet after a long interval, do they not come unbidden, while we marvel whence they come? He who has never swooned is not he who finds strange palaces and wildly familiar faces in coals that glow, is not he who beholds floating in midair the sad visions that the many may not view, is not he who ponders over the perfume of some novel flower, is not he whose brain grows bewildered with the intense meaning of some musical cadence which has never before arrested his attention. You read? You read? Here up.
Amid frequent and thoughtful endeavors to remember, amid earnest struggles to regather some token of the state of seeming nothingness into which my soul had lapsed, there have been moments when I have dreamed of success. There have been brief, very brief periods when I have conjured up remembrances which the lucid reason of a later epoch assures me could have had reference only to that condition of seeming consciousness. These shadows of memory tell indistinctly of tall figures that lifted and bore me in silence down, down, still down, till a hideous dizziness oppressed me at the mere idea of the interminableness of the descent. They tell also of a vague horror at my heart, on account of that heart's unnatural stillness. Then comes a sense of sudden motionlessness throughout all things, as if those who bore me, a ghastly train, had outrun in their descent the limits of the limitless, and paused from the wearisomeness of their toil. After this, I call to mind flatness and dampness, and then all is madness, the madness of a memory which busies itself among forbidden things. Very suddenly, there came back to my soul motion and sound, the tumultuous motion of the heart, and in my ears the sound of its beating. Then a pause in which all is blank. Then again sound and motion and touch, a tingling sensation pervading my frame. Then the mere consciousness of existence, without thought, a condition which lasted long. Then, very suddenly, thought and shuddering terror and earnest endeavor to comprehend my true state. Then a strong desire to lapse into insensibility. Then a rushing revival of soul and a successful effort to move. And now a full memory of the trial, of the judges, of the sable draperies, of the sentence, of the sickness, of the swoon. Then entire forgetfulness of all that followed, of all that a later day and much earnestness of endeavor have enabled me vaguely to recall. So far, I had not opened my eyes. I felt that I lay upon my back unbound. I reached out my hand, and it fell heavily upon something damp and hard. There I suffered it to remain for many minutes, while I strove to imagine where and what I could be. I longed, yet dared not to employ my vision. I dreaded the first glance at objects around me. It was not that I feared to look upon things horrible, but that I grew aghast lest there should be nothing to see. At length, with a wild desperation at heart, I quickly unclosed my eyes. My worst thoughts then were confirmed. The blackness of eternal night encompassed me. I struggled for breath. The intensity of the darkness seemed to oppress and stifle me. The atmosphere was intolerably close. I still lay quietly and made effort to exercise my reason. I brought to mind the inquisitorial proceedings and attempted, from that point, to deduce my real condition. The sentence had passed, and it appeared to me that a very long interval of time had since elapsed. Yet not for a moment did I suppose myself actually dead. Such a supposition, notwithstanding what we read in fiction, is altogether inconsistent with real existence. But where and in what state was I? The condemned to death, I knew, perished usually in the autos da fe, and one of these had been held on the very night of the day of my trial. Had I been remanded to my dungeon to await the next sacrifice, which would not take place for many months? This I at once saw could not be. Victims had been in immediate demand. Moreover, my dungeon, as well as all the condemned cells at Toledo, had stone floors, and light was not altogether excluded.
Anybody want to read? We have volunteer. Sure. Sure.
Okay.
You have to stand up here, though.
I'll do it.
Okay.
A fearful idea now suddenly drove the blood in torrents upon my heart, and for a brief period I once more relapsed into insensibility. Upon recovering, I at once started to my feet, trembling convulsively in every fiber. I thrust my arms wildly above and around me in all directions. I felt nothing, yet dreaded to move a step, lest I should be impeded by the walls of a tomb. Perspiration burst from every pore and stood in cold, big beads upon my forehead. The agony of suspense grew at length intolerable, and I cautiously moved forward with my arms extended and my eyes straining from their sockets in the hope of catching some faint ray of light. I proceeded for many paces, but still all was blackness and vacancy. I breathed more freely. It seemed evident that mine was not, at least, the most hideous of fates. And now, as I still continued to step cautiously onward, there came thronging upon my recollection 1,000 vague rumors of the horrors of Toledo. Of the dungeons there had been strange things narrated, fables I had always deemed them, but yet strange and too ghastly to repeat, save in a whisper. I was left to perish of starvation in this subterranean world of darkness, or what fate, perhaps even more fearful, awaited me. That result would be death, and the death of more than customary bitterness. I knew too well the character of my judges to doubt. The mode and the hour were all that occupied or distracted me. My outstretched hands at length encountered some solid obstruction. It was a wall, seemingly of stone masonry, very smooth, slimy, and cold. I followed it up, stepping with all the careful distrust with which certain antique narratives had inspired me. This process, however, afforded me no means of ascertaining the dimensions of my dungeon, as I might make its circuit and return to the point whence I set out, without being aware of the fact. So perfectly uniform seemed the wall. I therefore sought the knife which had been in my pocket when led into the inquisitorial chamber, but it was gone. My clothes had been exchanged for a wrapper of coarse serge. I had thought of forcing the blade in some minute crevice of the masonry so as to identify my point of departure. The difficulty, nevertheless, was but trivial. Although in the disorder of my fancy, it seemed at first insuperable. I tore a part of the hem from the robe and placed the fragment at full length and at right angles to the wall. In groping my way around the prison, I could not fail to encounter this rag upon completing the circuit. So, at least I thought, but I had not counted upon the extent of the dungeon or upon my own weakness. The ground was moist and slippery. I staggered onward for some time, when I stumbled and fell. My excessive fatigue induced me to remain prostrate, and sleep soon overtook me as I lay. Should I continue or?
Upon awaking and stretching forth an arm, I found beside me a loaf and a pitcher with water. I was too much exhausted to reflect upon this circumstance, but ate and drank with avidity. Shortly afterwards, I resumed my tour around the prison, and with much toil came at last upon the fragment of the serge. Up to the period when I fell, I had counted 52 paces, and upon resuming my walk, I had counted 48 more when I arrived at the rag. There were in all, then, 100 paces, and admitting 2 paces to a yard, I presumed the dungeon to be 50 yards in circuit. I had met, however, with many angles in the wall, and thus I could form no guess at the shape of the vault, for the vault I could not help supposing it to be. I had little object, certainly no hope, in these researches, but a vague curiosity prompted me to continue them. Quitting the wall, I resolved to cross the area of the enclosure. At first, I proceeded with extreme caution, for the floor, although seemingly of solid material, was treacherous with slime. At length, however, I took courage and did not hesitate to step firmly, endeavoring to cross in as direct a line as possible. I had advanced some 10 or 12 paces in this manner when the remnant of the torn hem of my robe became entangled between my legs. I stepped on it and fell violently on my face. In the confusion attending my fall, I did not immediately apprehend a somewhat startling circumstance, and yet, in a few seconds afterwards, and while I still lay prostrate, arrested my attention. It was this: my chin rested upon the floor of the prison, but my lips and the upper portion of my head, although seemingly at a less elevation than the chin, touched nothing. At the same time, my forehead seemed bathed in a clammy vapor, and a peculiar smell of decayed fungus arose to my nostrils. I put forward my arm and shuddered to find that I had fallen at the very brink of a circular pit, whose extent, of course, I had no means of ascertaining at the moment. Groping about the masonry just below the margin, I succeeded in dislodging a small fragment and let it fall into the abyss. For many seconds, I hearkened to its reverberations as it dashed against the sides of the chasm in its descent. At length, there was a sullen plunge into water, succeeded by loud echoes. At the same moment, there came a sound resembling the quick opening and as rapidly closing of a door overhead, with a faint gleam of light flashed suddenly through the gloom and just as suddenly faded away. I saw clearly the doom that had been prepared for me, and congratulated myself upon the timely accident by which I had escaped. Another step before my fall, and the world had seen me no more. And the death just avoided was of that very character which I regarded as fabulous and frivolous in the tales respecting the Inquisition. To the victims of its tyranny, there was the choice of death with the direst physical agonies, or death with its most hideous moral horrors. I had been reserved for the latter. By long suffering, my nerves had been unstrung until I trembled at the sound of my own voice, and had become, in every respect, a fitting subject for the species of torture which awaited me. Next.
I can go.
Good. Okay.
Shaking in every limb, I groped my way back to the wall, resolving there to perish rather than risk the terrors of the wells, of which my imagination now pictured many in various positions about the dungeon. In other conditions of mind, I might have had courage to end my misery at once, by a plunge into one of these abysses. But now I was the veriest of cowards. Neither could I forget what I had read of these pits, that the sudden extinction of life formed no part of their most horrible plan. Agitation of spirit kept me awake for many long hours, but at length I again slumbered. Upon arousing, I found by my side, as before, a loaf and a pitcher of water. A burning thirst consumed me, and I emptied the vessel at a draught. I must have been drugged, for scarcely had I drunk before I became irresistibly drowsy. A deep sleep fell upon me, a sleep like that of death. How long it lasted, of course I know not. But when, once again, I unclosed my eyes, the objects around me were visible. By a wild, sulphurous luster, the origin of which I could not at first determine, I was enabled to see the extent and aspect of the prison. In its size, I had been greatly mistaken. The whole circuit of its walls did not exceed 25 yards. For some minutes, this fact occasioned me a world of vain trouble. Vain indeed, for what could be of less importance, under the terrible circumstances which environed me than the mere dimensions of my dungeon. But my soul took a wild interest in trifles, and I busied myself in endeavors to account for the error I had committed in my measurement. The truth at length flashed upon me. In my first attempt at exploration, I had counted 52 paces, up to the period when I fell. I must then have been within a pace or two of the fragment of surge. In fact, I had nearly performed the circuit of the vault. I then slept, and, upon waking, I must have returned upon my steps, thus supposing the circuit nearly double what it actually was. My confusion of mind prevented me from observing that I began my tour with the wall to the left, and ended it with the wall to the right. I had been deceived, too, in respect to the shape of the enclosure. In feeling my way, I had found many angles, and thus deduced an idea of great irregularity. So potent is the effect of total darkness upon one arousing from lethargy or sleep. The angles were simply those of a few slight depressions, or niches, at odd intervals. The general shape of the prison was square. What I had taken for masonry seemed now to be iron, or some other metal, in huge plates, whose sutures or joints occasioned the depression. The entire surface of this metallic enclosure was rudely daubed in all the hideous and repulsive devices to which the charnel superstition of the monks has given rise. The figures of fiends and aspects of menace, with skeleton forms, and other more really fearful images, overspread and disfigured the walls. I observed that the outlines of these monstrosities were sufficiently distinct, but that the colors seemed faded and blurred, as if from the effects of a damp atmosphere. I now noticed the floor, too, which was of stone. In the center yawned the circular pit from whose jaws I had escaped, but it was the only one in the dungeon. All this I saw indistinctly and by much effort, for my personal condition had been greatly changed during slumber. I now lay upon my back, and at full length, on a species of low framework of wood. To this I was securely bound by a long strap resembling a surcingle. It passed in many convolutions about my limbs and body, leaving at liberty only my head, and my left arm to such an extent that I could, by dint of much exertion, supply myself with food from an earthen dish which lay by my side on the floor. I saw, to my horror, that the pitcher had been removed. I say to my horror, for I was consumed with intolerable thirst. This thirst appeared to be the design of my persecutors to stimulate, for the food in the dish was meat pungently seasoned. Someone else can go.
Looking upward, I surveyed the ceiling of my prison. It was some 30 or 40 feet overhead, and constructed much as the side walls. In one of its panels, a very singular figure riveted my full attention. It was the painted figure of Time, as he is commonly represented.
Rachel, can you move back a little bit?
Oh.
I can see you. Go ahead. You're good.
Save that, in lieu of a scythe, he held what, at a casual glance, I supposed to be the pictured image of a huge pendulum, such as we see on antique clocks. There was something, however, in the appearance of this machine which caused me to regard it more attentively. While I gazed directly upward at it, for its position was immediately over my own, I fancied that I saw it in motion. In an instant afterward, the fancy was confirmed. Its sweep was brief and, of course, slow. I watched it for some minutes, somewhat in fear, but more in wonder. Wearied at length with observing its dull movement, I turned my eyes on the other objects in the cell. A slight noise attracted my notice, and, looking to the floor, I saw several enormous rats traversing it. They had issued from the well which lay just within view to my right. Even then, while I gazed, they came up in troops, hurriedly, with ravenous eyes, allured by the scent of the meat. And this it required much effort and attention to scare them away. It might have been half an hour, perhaps even an hour, for I could take but imperfect note of time, before I again cast my eyes upward. What I then saw confounded and amazed me. The sweep of the pendulum had increased in extent to nearly a yard. As a natural consequence, its velocity was also much greater. But what mainly disturbed me was the idea that it had imperceptibly descended. I now observed, with what horror it is needless to say, that its nether extremity was formed of a crescent of glittering steel, about a foot in length from horn to horn. The horns upward, and the under edge evidently as keen as that of a razor. Like a razor also, it seemed massy and heavy, tapering from the edge into a solid and broad structure above. It was appended to a weighty rod of brass, and the whole hissed as it swung through the air. I could no longer doubt the doom prepared for me by monkish ingenuity and torture. My cognizance of the pit had become known to the inquisitorial agents, the pit whose horrors had been destined for so bold a recusant as myself, the pit typical of hell, and regarded by rumor as the ultimate tula of all their punishments. The plunge into this pit I had avoided by the merest of accidents, and I knew that surprise, or entrapment into torment, formed an important portion of all the grotesquerie of these dungeon deaths. Having failed to fall, it was no part of the demon plan to hurl me into the abyss, and thus, there being no alternative, a different and a milder destruction awaited me. Milder. I half smiled in my agony as I thought of such application of such a term. Yes.
What boots it to tell of the long, long hours of horror more than mortal, during which I counted the rushing vibrations of the steel, inch by inch, line by line, was a descent only appreciable at intervals that seemed ages. Down and still down it came. Days passed. It might have been that many days passed ere it swept so closely over me as to fan me with its acrid breath. The odor of the sharp steel forced itself into my nostrils. I prayed. I wearied heaven with my prayer for its more speedily descent. I grew frantically mad and struggled to force myself upward against the sweep of the fearful scimitar. And then I fell suddenly calm and lay smiling at the glittering death as a child at some rare bauble. There was another interval of utter insensibility. It was brief, for upon again lapsing into life, there had been no perceptible descent in the pendulum. But it might have been long, for I knew there were demons who took note of my swoon, and who could have arrested the vibration at pleasure. Upon my recovery, too, I felt very, inexplicably sick and weak, as if through long inanition.
Yes.
Even amid the agonies of that period, the human nature craved food. With painful effort, I outstretched my left arm as far as my bonds permitted and took possession of the small remnant which had been spared me by the rats. As I put a portion of it within my lips, there rushed in my mind a half
half-formed thought of joy, of hope. Yet, what business had I with hope? It was, as I say, a half-formed thought. Man has many such which are never completed. I felt that it was of joy, of hope, but I felt also that it had perished in its formation. In vain I struggled to perfect, to regain it. Long suffering had nearly annihilated all my ordinary power of mind. I was an imbecile, an idiot. The vibration of the pendulum was at right angle to my length. I saw that the crescent was designed to cross the region of the heart. It would fray the surge of my robe. It would return and repeat its operation again and again. Notwithstanding its terrifically wide sweep, some 30 feet or more, and the hissing vigor of its descent, sufficient to sunder those very walls of iron. Still, the fraying of my robe would be all that for several minutes it would accomplish. And at this thought, I paused. I dared not go further than this reflection. I dwelt upon it with a pertinency of attention, as if in so dwelling I could arrest here the descent of the steel. I forced myself to ponder upon the sound of the crescent as it should pass across the garment, upon the particular thrilling sensation which the friction of cloth produces on the nerves. I pondered upon all this frivolity until my teeth were on edge.
Anybody else want to read? I'll keep it going anyway. Down, steadily down it crept. I took a frenzied pleasure in contrasting its downward with its lateral velocity, to the right, to the left, far and wide, with the shriek and the plunge of a damned spirit, to my heart, with the stealthy pace of the tiger. I alternately laughed and howled as the one or the other idea grew predominant. Down, certainly relentlessly down. It vibrated within 3 inches of my bosom. I struggled violently, furiously to free my left arm. This was free only from the elbow to the hand. I could reach the latter from the platter beside me to my mouth with great effort, but no farther. Could I have broken the fastenings above the elbow, I would have seized and attempted to arrest the pendulum. I might as well have attempted to arrest an avalanche. Down, still unceasingly, still inevitably down. I gasped and struggled at each vibration. I shrunk convulsively at its every sweep. My eyes followed its outward or upward swirls with the eagerness of the most unmeaning despair. They closed themselves spasmodically at the descent, although death would have been a relief. Oh, how unspeakable. I still quivered in every nerve to think how slight a sinking or slipping of the machinery would precipitate that keen, glistening axe upon my bosom. It was hope that prompted the nerve to quiver, the frame to shrink. It was hope, the hope that triumphs on the rack, that whispers to the death-condemned, even in the dungeons of the Inquisition. I saw that some 10 or 12 vibrations would bring the steel in actual contact with my robe, and with this observation, there suddenly came over my spirit all the keen, collected calmness of despair. For the first time during many hours, or perhaps days, I thought. Now it once occurred to me that the bandage or surcingle which enveloped me was unique. I was tied by no separate cords. The first stroke of the razor-like crescent athwart any portion of the band would so detach it that it might be unwound from my person by means of my left hand. But how fearful in that case, the proximity of the steel. The result of the slightest struggle, how deadly. Was it likely, moreover, that the minions of the torturer had not foreseen and provided for that possibility? Was it possible that the bandage crossed my bosom in the track of the pendulum? Dreading to find my fate, and as it seemed my last hope, frustrated, I so far elevated my head as to obtain a distinct view of my breast. The surcingle enveloped my limbs and body close in all directions, save in the path of the destroying crescent. Scarcely had I dropped my head back in its original position when there flashed upon my mind what I cannot better describe than as the unformed half of that idea of deliverance to which I have previously alluded, and of which a moiety only floated indeterminately through my brain when I raised food to my burning lips. The whole thought was now present, feeble, scarcely sane, scarcely definite, but still entire. I proceeded at once with the nervous energy of despair to attempt its execution. For many hours, the immediate vicinity of the low framework upon which I lay had been literally swarming with rats. They were wild, bold, ravenous, their red eyes glaring upon me as if they waited but for motionlessness on my part to make me their prey. To what food, I thought, had they been accustomed in the well? They had devoured, in spite of all my efforts to prevent them, all but a small remnant of the contents of the dish. I had fallen into a habitual seesaw or wave of the hand about the platter, and at length the unconscious uniformity of the movement deprived it of effect. In their voracity, the vermin frequently fastened their sharp fangs in my fingers. With the particles of the oily and spicy viand which now remained, I thoroughly rubbed the bandage wherever I could reach it. Then, raising my hand from the floor, I lay breathlessly still. At first, the ravenous animals were startled and terrified at the change, at the cessation of movement. They shrank alarmedly back. Many sought the well. But this was only for a moment. I had not counted in vain upon their voracity. Observing that I had remained without motion, one or two of the boldest leaped upon the framework and smelt at the surcingle. This seemed the signal for a general rush. Forth from the well they hurried in fresh troops. They clung to the wood, they overran it, and leapt in hundreds upon my person. The measured movement of the pendulum disturbed them not at all. Avoiding its strokes, they busied themselves with the anointed bandage. They pressed. They swarmed upon me in ever-accumulating heaps. They writhed upon my throat. Their cold lips sought my own. I was half stifled by their thronging pressure. A disgust for which the world has no name swelled my bosom and chilled with a calm, deadly clamminess my heart. Yet 1 minute, and I felt that the struggle would be over. Plainly, I perceived the loosening of the bandage. I knew that in more than one place it must be already severed. With a more than human resolution, I lay still. Who wants to read?
Nor had I erred in my calculations, nor had I endured in vain. I at length felt that I was free. The surcingle hung in ribbons from my body, but the stroke of the pendulum already pressed upon my bosom. It had divided the serge of the robe. It had cut through the linen beneath. Twice again it swung. A sharp sense of pain shot through every nerve, but the moment of escape had arrived. At a wave of my hand, my deliverers hurried tumultuously away. With a steady movement, cautious, sidelong, shrinking, and slow, I slid from the embrace of the bandage and beyond the reach of the scimitar. For the moment, at least, I was free. Free! And in the grasp of the Inquisition. I had scarcely stepped from my wooden bed of horror upon the stone floor of the prison when the motion of the hellish machine ceased, and I believe it drawn up by some invisible force through the ceiling. This was a lesson which I took desperately to heart. My every motion was undoubtedly watched. Free, I had but escaped death in one form of agony to be delivered unto worse than death in some other. With that thought, I rolled my eyes nervously around the barriers of iron that hemmed me in. Something unusual, some change, which at first I could not appreciate distinctly. It was obvious had taken place in the apartment. For many minutes of a dreamy and trembling abstraction, I busied myself in vain, unconnected conjecture. During this period, I became aware for the first time of the origin of the sulphurous light which illumined the cell. It proceeded from a fissure about half an inch in width, extending entirely above the prison at the base of the walls. Around the prison. Sulphurous light which illumined the cell. It proceeded from a fissure about a half an inch in width, extending entirely around the prison at the base of its walls, which thus appeared and were completely separated from the floor. I endeavored, but of course in vain, to look through the aperture. As I arose from the attempt, the mystery of the alteration in the chamber broke at once upon my understanding. I have observed that although the outlines of the figures from the walls were sufficiently distinct, yet the colors seemed blurred and infinite. These colors had now assumed, and were momentarily assuming, a startling and most intense brilliancy that gave to the spectral and fiendish portraitures an aspect that might have thrilled even firmer nerves than my own. Demon eyes of a wild and ghastly vivacity glared upon me in 1,000 directions, where none had been visible before, and gleamed the lurid luster of a fire that I could not force my imagination to regard as unreal.
Anybody want to finish it? Robert, you want to take it?
Unreal. Even while I breathed, there came to my nostrils the breath of the vapor of heated iron. A suffocating odor pervaded the prison. A deeper glow settled each moment in the eyes that glared at my agonies. A richer tint of crimson diffused itself over the pictured horrors of blood. I panted. I gasped for breath. There could be no doubt of the design of my tormentors. Oh, most unrelenting. Oh, most demoniac of men. I shrank from the glowing metal to the center of the cell. Amid the thought of the fiery destruction that impended, the idea of the coolness of the well came over my soul like a balm. I rushed to its deadly brink. I threw my straining vision below. The glare of the enkindled roof illumined its inmost recesses. Yet for a wild moment, did my spirit refuse to comprehend the meaning of what I saw. At length, it wrestled its way into my soul. It burned itself in upon my shuddering reason. Oh, for a voice to speak. Oh, horror. Oh, any horror but this. With a shriek, I rushed from the margin and buried my face in my hands, weeping bitterly. The heat rapidly increased and once again I looked up, shuddering as if with a fit of the ague. There had been a second change in the cell, and now the change was obviously in the form. As before, it was in vain that I at first endeavored to appreciate or understand what was taking place. But not long was I left in doubt. The inquisitorial vengeance had been hurried by my twofold escape, and there was to be no more dallying with the King of Terrors. The room had been square. I saw that 2 of its iron angles were now acute, 2 consequently obtuse. The fearful difference quickly increased with a low rumbling or moaning sound. In an instant the apartment had shifted its form into that of a lozenge. But the alteration stopped not here. I neither hoped nor desired it to stop. I could have clasped the red walls to my bosom as a garment of eternal peace. Death, I said, any death but that of the pit. Fool! Might I not have known that into the pit it was the object of the burning iron to urge me? Could I resist its glow? Or if even that, could I withstand its pressure? And now, flatter and flatter grew the lozenge with a rapidity that left me no time for contemplation. Its center, and of course, its greatest width, came just over the yawning gulf. I shrank back, but the closing walls pressed me resistlessly onward. At length, for my seared and writhing body, there was no longer an inch of foothold on the firm floor of the prison. I struggled no more, but the agony of my soul found vent in one loud, long, and final scream of despair. I felt that I tottered upon the brink. I averted my eyes. There was a discordant hum of human voices. There was a loud blast as of many trumpets. There was a harsh grating as of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back. An outstretched arm caught my own as I fell, fainting, into the abyss. It was that of General Lasalle. The French army had entered Toledo. The Inquisition was in the hands of its enemies.
By the way, is Jose still on? He's on enough.
No.
Okay, let me just ask. So, well, there's much that might be said, but rather than say any, I'll just indicate one thing by means of, there's a little book. Oh, you have a little book, right? Not about the story, that's that story, but something else that Poe wrote. Not very long. I just want to refer to it.
Jose is listening in, by the way.
It's called Time and Space. We appreciate time by events alone. For this reason, we define time somewhat improperly as a succession of events. But the fact itself that events are our sole means of appreciating time tends to the engendering of the erroneous idea that events are time, that the more numerous the events, the longer the time, and the converse. This erroneous idea, there can be no doubt that we should absolutely entertain in all cases, but for our practical means of correcting the impressions, such as clocks and the movement of the heavenly bodies, whose revolutions, after all, we only assume to be regular. Space is precisely analogous with time. By objects alone, we estimate space, and we might as rationally define it, the succession of objects, as time, the succession of events. But as before, the fact that we have no other means of estimating space than objects affords us tends to the false idea that objects are space, that the more numerous the objects, the greater the space, and the converse. And this erroneous impression we should receive in all cases, but for our practical means of correcting it, such as yard measures and other conventional measures which resolve themselves ultimately into certain natural standards, such as And he gives these various things. And then just the last part here. There's more, but I just want to read this. The mind can form some conception of the distance, however vast, between the sun and Uranus, because there are 10 objects which mentally intervene. And he counts the planets Mercury, Venus, Earth, Mars, Ceres, Vesta, Juno, Pallas, Jupiter, and Saturn. These objects serve, keep in mind, obviously, this is written in the 1840s. These objects serve as stepping stones to the mind, which nevertheless is utterly lost in the attempt at establishing a notion of the interval between Uranus and Sirius. Lost, yet clearly not on account of the mere distance. But why should, and Sirius is the double star. It's about 8.5 light years away from Earth, and it's very bright. So he's comparing this. He says, why should we not conceive the abstract idea of the distance 2 miles as readily as that of the distance of 1, but simply because between Uranus and Sirius, we happen to know that all is void. And from what I have already said, it follows that this vacuity, this want of intervening points, will cause to fall short of the truth any notion we shall endeavor to form. In fact, having once passed the limits of absolutely practical admeasurement by means of intervening objects, our ideas of distances are one. They have no variation. Thus, in truth, we think of the interval between Uranus and Sirius precisely as that between Saturn and Uranus, or of that between any one planet and its intermediate neighbor. Now, I just wanted to read that because I think the only thing I'd like to say about this story is that this is a story that discusses space and time. I'd like to hear what people think. So, just in general, not necessarily about what I just said, but whatever is your impression.
I didn't get that, but the thing that stuck out to me was this thing at the beginning of hearing the revolution, the idea of revolution in the voices, because it's not, how would you hear revolution and rumbling in voice? It seemed like he was like, putting a little clue in there or something. And obviously he's in the Inquisition for a reason, so he's done something,
right.
Spoken out or, done something against the Inquisition. So.
Can you just come up? I just want to make sure people up can see. I know it's a little bit, but it's better because there's people watching.
Yeah, if you stand closer to it, they'll be able to hear you.
Oh, okay.
Just go ahead and just say what you were saying. That way it's easier to.
I just was saying that this thing at the beginning about hearing revolution in the voices, the rumble of the Inquisition voices seemed like it stuck out because why would you hear revolution, in voice? That's not like something you would commonly think of. And that he had obviously been, tortured because he had done something against the Inquisition. So, like, the whole story seemed like something of a clue of, like, revolution against Inquisition. And then just the fact that he used his reason to get out of it and was successful.
Yeah.
But that's like also related to what Dennis was saying, right? I feel like the way that the sentence is written, it brings, I don't remember exactly how it's phrased, but it obviously there's an emphasis on the word revolution. But then the next thing is the turning of a mill wheel.
Mm-hmm.
So like, I think if he's playing with the affect of the word revolution, kind of, it's the Inquisition, the revolution, then it's this very physical thing. It's like a sound.
Which also isn't something you would think of in the middle of being
right.
Yeah.
Right.
See what she's saying? She's saying that there are things that are in the story that are saying something a little bit different. Just like the thing at the beginning with the Latin quatrain, right? Which is always omitted or usually omitted whenever it's read. And of course, then at the end, the French Revolution releases him. Yeah. Whatever we think about how that's done, that's what that is. General Lassalle's coming from the French Revolution, and they're coming into Spain.
So you were saying that you said before that it was I don't remember exactly how you phrased it, but that it was intentionally kind of anachronistic.
Yeah, because for example, take the end. I mean, it seems like he's going to fall into a pit, and then all of a sudden the walls have to go back, and then he's got a hand that's going to grab him. I mean, how does that all happen? right?
Like it's like the stage setting starts to kind of come apart. Like,
Well, I'm just saying, just think about it physically. He's saying apparently he's about to fall into a pit, right?
Yeah.
But that's what you get from the thing. He says he's teetering on the edge, and then the walls. Well, actually, somebody should just read it. Just read the passage so you can see somebody just read it yourself. You take it out of the book because the ending is interesting from that standpoint.
Which part?
The very last paragraph.
Do you want to make right here?
Yeah, you have it, right? Please go ahead. I just wanted you. But
there was a discordant hum of human voices. There was a loud blast as of many trumpets. There was a harsh grating as of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back. An outstretched arm caught my own as I fell, fainting, into the abyss. It was that of General Lasalle. The French army had entered Toledo. The Inquisition was in the hands of its enemies.
right. So how does that physically happen? Right? Because just before that, the sentences before that say, at length from my seared and writhing body, there was no longer an inch of foothold. There's not even an inch there, right? On the firm floor of the prison, I struggled no more, but the agony of my soul found vent in one long, loud, and final scream of despair. I felt that I tottered upon the brink. I averted my eyes. And then the next paragraph says this. I mean, it can't physically happen. I mean, right?
Where the voices come from, if he's surrounded by
Yeah,
walls. And
yeah, exactly. It can't physically. It's not a right.
It's like a dream.
Well, it's something. It may not be a dream, but it's clearly not meant. What I'm suggesting is that Rachel already said there are clues in the story that there's something else here, because that couldn't have physically happened that way.
Right,
and
it's
it's
metaphorical, yeah.
I mean, there's a lot more to talk about in all kinds of ways about it.
It reminded me when he was going around, like taking the measurement sort of the descent into the maelstrom. It's the same kind
You
of,
come up again also, so you can see.
Yeah, I thought it.
yeah, I was just saying, we read a few weeks ago, the descent into the maelstrom. And it's the same thing when the protagonist is facing imminent death, and he, in sort of in the midst of his despair, he moves beyond that and he starts doing things, which is these intense observations of things that seem to be trivialities, right? What's going up, what's going down, what's spinning around, how it's spinning around, and so on. And in the same way, this guy says, well, it seemed to be trivial, but I wanted to know what the dimensions were of my prison, right? And then he does all these calculations and then figures out when he can finally see it, actually it was wrong. But there is a purpose to this, because I think it's right before that, and he does this a couple of times where he's sort of in like a fog, and then he says, and suddenly thought, right? That happens at the beginning, and I think it happens 3 times if I'm remembering correctly, where suddenly there's there's thought, and then the last time there's hope with it, which is when he decides on this awful thing of having the rats climb all over him. But anyway, that's just a couple thoughts I have.
Anybody else right now? If you have something, it'd be fine. But otherwise, we'll come back now to kind of to where I stopped you before, and maybe,
At the quote from the La Cantata.
Yeah. I think what we can do here, I'll read this and we'll talk about it. But this is from now, Alan Salisbury is referring to a story from Poe, taking a passage where Poe is going after, remember we're talking about methods of investigation. So Poe has the following that he says. It appears that long, long ago in the night of time, there lived a Turkish philosopher, or Hindu possibly, called Aristotle. This person introduced, or at all events propagated, what was termed the deductive or a priori mode of investigation. He started with what he maintained to be axioms or self-evident truths, and thence proceeded logically to results. His greatest disciples were one Euclid and one Kant, or Kant. Well, Aristotle flourished supreme until advent of one Hobbes, surnamed Ettrick's Shepherd, who was a contemporary of Poe, by the way, which he called the a posteriori or inductive method versus deductive. His plan referred altogether to sensation. And then Allen says here, Poe is having a little fun here at the expense of Francis Bacon and James Hogg, a Scottish writer for Blackwood's magazine, sometimes called the Ettrick Shepherd. He proceeded to, by observing, analyzing, and classifying facts, instances of nature, as instances of nature, as they were effectively called, into general laws. Aristotle's method, in a word, was based on noumena, Hogg's on phenomena. Well, so great was the admiration excited by this latter system, the inductive system, that at its first introduction, Aristotle fell into disrepute, but finally he recovered ground and was permitted to divide the realm of truth with his more modern rival. The savants now maintained that the Aristotelian and Baconian roads were the sole possible avenues to knowledge. Now, I do not complain of these ancients so much because their logic is by their own showing utterly baseless, worthless, and fantastic altogether, as because of their pompous and imbecile proscription, that is prevention or censoring, of all other roads of truth, of all other means for its attainment than the two preposterous paths, the one of creeping and the one of crawling, to which they have dared to confine the soul that loves nothing so well as to soar. Now, this passage, which I read quickly, and I know some people have it, some people don't, is very important, I think, that we just introduce here. This is something we'll be talking about if we have other classes, much more. But what Poe is talking about here is two different methods, the deductive method and the inductive method. He's saying both of them are no good, and there's another method. And he says, and that's the method in which the soul does not creep or crawl, but soars. Now, let's come back to the story, and there's one other thing I want to do. Do we have Rick? Is he actually on or not? I don't know if he ever got on. Rick Sanders, if he ever got on or not.
Oh, no.
That's okay. I just want to refer for a minute to the Canto 3 from Dante's Inferno. I'm just going to read part of it, this is an English translation. It's way better to hear it in the Italian first and then hear it in the English, but we don't have someone who speaks Italian. So I'm just going to read the canto, the first part. This is at the vestibule of hell. And this is when Dante and Virgil are about to walk into the beginning of hell.
I think Reynaldo speaks Italian, actually, right?
Do you speak Italian? Can you read?
I'm trying.
Did we have it in Italian? Because I only have it here in the
We
English.
could pull it up.
Okay, why don't you pull it up? I'd rather do it that way rather than just have it said. Though, of course, the translation is never the same as the poem anyway. So while we're looking for that, while we're pulling that up, I just referenced this idea that what it's about is space and time, because he crawls around on the floor to try to figure out how big space is, and then he's looking at the image of time, and it's a pendulum. Yeah, right. Well, and the whole thing is, does he have it? He's ready to.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, let him look it over. You want to look it over first, and then. Or just when you're ready, please just come up, because I want you to recite it.
How many lines do you think?
Just 2, 4, 6, 9.
It's the first 9 lines.
Down to abandon all hope. Sure. Just come up.
Yeah,
and
just come up
just
so
read
they
it,
can
we
hear you on the mic.
we can- Yeah, because you can turn and face people, but this way they get it on the mic. That's what we're trying to do.
Inferno, canto 3. Per me si va nella città dolente, per me si va nell'eterno dolore, per me si va tra la perduta gente. Giustizia mosse il mio alto fattore, fecemi la divina potestate. La somma sapienza è il primo amore, dinanzi a me non for cose create, se non eterne, e io eterno duro. Lasciate ogni speranza voi che entrate.
Right. Says, I am the way into the city of woe. I am the way to a forsaken people. I am the way into eternal sorrow. Sacred justice moved my architect. I was raised here by divine omnipotence, primordial love, and ultimate intellect. Only those elements time cannot wear were made before me. Beyond time I stand. Abandon all hope, ye who enter here. So that's what's above the gate of hell. And what Poe has proposed is that above the gate of a market to be erected upon the site of the Jacobin Club in Paris, he once had said, here the wicked mob, unappeased, long cherished the hatred of innocent blood. Now that the fatherland is saved and the cave of death demolished, where grim death has been, life and health appear. And in the story, a couple of times he says that he's been condemned into hell. Okay, so now anybody, but I'd rather hear if people have other things that they have to say about it. I'll just, one thing I want to say, just sort of in conclusion on this part, but there's a lot to it, the story.
Well, I have a question.
Sure.
Which is, I understand there's some kind of parallel between this epigram that he gives his story and that Dante puts over the gates of hell. It seems, and based on the backgrounder that you gave on the role of the Jacobins, it seems like there's a relatively clear, at least I can see how he's not making a positive statement about the Jacobins, but if I guess I don't know who General LaSalle is, so that's my own ignorance. But if you're saying that it's the French Revolution that is saving him from the Inquisition at the end of the story, then it seems like a very ambiguous statement about the French Revolution.
It's Poe. Poe has a sense of humor, but just to say, I don't mean it's all funny, but the stories are being written also against literary conceits, literary practices of the time. Like one of the things he's doing here, which we're not going to take time, although maybe I might do it, is the story. There was a form of writing which was very popular in certain of the English and Scottish magazines, Blackwood's magazine in particular. And the idea was that you were supposed to describe things with great amounts of sensationalism. It was all about how you felt and how things happened and how things moved, very much like what you have here, the story. So part of this is a satire on that style. But what's also happening in the story, I mean, obviously there's two things. There's the pit and there's the pendulum. That's what it's called, right? It's two different forms of torture. Poe was very aware of what had happened with the Jacobins because he had gone to Paris, for one. He was a child of the certain faction of the American Revolution, and he never had, as many people didn't, as Schiller didn't, for example, any mistake. He had no romance about the idea that this revolution in France, which basically created an inquisition called the Terror. It was very difficult to know what answer to give these people, right, to please them in any way. they famously killed approximately 17,000 people in different places in France with the guillotine. Not everybody was guillotined, some people were hanged. But you don't just take Paris, you have to look at Bordeaux, you have to look at Marseille, and there were killings going on. And basically what happened was that most of the people who were associated with the factions that had supported the American Revolution were all executed by the time you got through 1794. It was a faction that Ben Franklin had been associated with, and that also had included at one point the king and Marie Antoinette. Now that was organized by Vergennes, the French finance minister, and also in a different way, not unimportantly, Beaumarchais, who was the author of the famous play The Marriage of Figaro, which is actually about himself. So sort of autobiographical thing. Both Marc Beaumarchais and Vergennes had been major supporters of Franklin in the period when Franklin came to Paris to raise the money for the American Revolution. Franklin spent almost the entire revolution in Paris, or in France, I should say. And so that faction, without which there could not have been an American Revolution. They financed it, and they also, of course, also sent troops, and there were also military, like Rochambeau at the Battle of Yorktown, when the fleet came and blocked in formed a blockade that stopped the British from reinforcing Cornwallis. So the British Empire, whose main enemy was France, and that's the two empires were at war that had just been ended in 1763 in the 7 Years' War. And when the French were supporting the Americans, that was actually technically illegal. So, for example, when Lafayette came over, he didn't come from France, he came from Spain. He had to move his ship, take it to Spain, and then from Spain, launch it, right? So that the king, Louis the 16th or Marie Antoinette, everybody was able to disavow it, okay? It was entirely illegal for the French to be involved, and they claimed not to be involved. Carlos III of Spain was also a supporter of the American Revolution, and there was a group of people, and it's important to realize this, like Francisco Goya, the painter, was part of a faction who were all pro-French, and they wore French dress as part of their expression of their support for the French Revolution. So the thing to understand is that when Poe is using this, he's making a statement, especially when the revolution first came to Spain. The very first part, everybody thought it was a liberation, and it did, in fact. The Goya faction was called the Illuminati. That's what they called themselves.
Las Luces, I think it's
Spanish. Yeah, Las Luces. Right. And so they formed it. There are many things to say about this, which are very interesting about how this all happened. So what Poe is doing, though, is that he's using things that he knows people are going to know, but he's composing them in a story in which he's got another kind of objective. And it's pretty clear that the first investigations that our protagonist does, once he wakes up, he just starts crawling around the ground. And then he goes to sleep. And he crawls around again. He goes exactly in the opposite direction. He doesn't know that's what he did. Then what he's going to do is he's going to go across what he believes is this 100-yard wide, prison. And he says, "I'm walking with greater assurance now." But then he trips, okay, and he almost falls into a pit. So that method didn't work. That just didn't operate for him, right? And so that's Poe's is showing you that method doesn't work. The thing that happens with the rats is definitely not that method. That I guess if you have something or anybody else has something to say about what happens there, what does he do that causes him to get himself out of that? In the case of the pendulum of the pit, that was an accident. He tripped. And then he was, just didn't fall in. And he said, if I had gone another step, so in other words, if I had continued with this method, I would have gone in the pit. The other one clearly works. So anybody have anything to say about what he does? Because that one is not the same.
I think it's also interesting. You see how this method fails when he's also estimating the space of, where he is. He says something like 25 yards, but when the light comes in, he's able to see that he was just completely wrong. Mm-hmm. So it's like.
Right, that's his deduction. He deduces this from what he thinks he's right.
Yeah, but it's like in this entire story, you're seeing a succession of hypotheses. And it's only until he has that idea to actually, cover the bondage with the meat so that the rats can eat it. That's the first time he says he actually thought. So that method works.
But there's, you're existing.
Well, no, you go ahead.
Well, so the idea comes in like two parts, right? And the first comes when he first puts the food in his mouth.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's right. He says that. You're right. He says a half-formed idea.
Yeah.
Right?
So he has it's all within the situation that he's like dying of thirst and he's being tortured with salted meat. Then he finally succumbs to the need to eat. And somehow in the act of eating is like he has like a premonition or something, or he has like a foreknowledge of that solution.
It's interesting to see it in my edition. These things are in italics, like he said earlier. Even amid all the agonies of that period, the human nature craved food. And he's got craved food in italics. And then the next time he's got italics is this thing that he says, scarcely had I dropped back my head in its original position when there flashed upon my mind what I cannot better describe than as the unformed half, that's in italics, of that idea of deliverance to which I have previously alluded, and of which a moiety only floated indeterminately through my brain when I raised food to my burning lips. And he has food in italics again.
Oh, that's it. Yeah, it's not in this copies that we have.
Yeah, it wouldn't be in your, yeah, right. This, mine is like this, the way that it was printed when he printed it. So what is that? Well, because the point is somehow you want to survive no matter what, right? You're at this point, you're going to die. So why is this drive for food? It's a food for thought idea. That term, food for thought. That's what this, and I mean, now I've read this story a lot. I mean, I first read the story when I was 10. Okay, and so I've been reading this because it's a horror story. This is why I read it. And the movie had come out, and I wanted to read the story, so I read it. And I only say that because to this day, I think about that idea of rats crawling out, and they're all over you, and you are gonna do that. Right. So what is it? What does that mean in terms of, it's one thing to think about it abstractly, but if you think about doing it, what's involved in that?
In that kind of solution?
Yeah. Right, the pendulum's coming down. It's getting closer and closer. As he says, it will take only another 12 times or so. He said more or less, right, before it's going to hit me. And it's only really at that point that he comes up with this. So apart from the fact that clearly he wanted to survive, that's clear. But what did it require?
Well, certainly overcoming what I would think would be a natural fear of having rats all over you. They're kissing him. I mean, he describes their cold lips or touching his lips. I mean, that must be really pretty. Okay,
full disclosure, okay? If a large rat ran in this room right now, I'm out of here, okay? One, okay? if you start talking about 5 or 6,
You'll never come back.
I'm like, I'm crazy at that point. Hundreds of rats.
They're in the back, actually, in the alley.
Of course they are. We're in the back.
We saw them one day.
And one thing that occurred to me when it was being read was that, I don't know, over intellectualize it, but like you have the pendulum going over his body, and then you have he's very explicit to say that he's like waving his arm over this like last piece of meat. So you have like the dish, this little morsel of salted meat, and his almost like unconscious effort to preserve his life by chasing away these vermin. And then at a certain point, the second half of the idea is that meat actually has a
life.
Yeah,
right.
But not by eating it.
Right. Not by eating it. Right? By having them eat the bandage, the surcingle. He's going to have to use the rats that are going to be feeding on him anyway.
Yeah.
To feed on the surcingle, rip it up, and then he slides off.
Right. And it's the only way to do it, because he said he might be able to break it, but if he is trying to break all these things, then the thing's going to hit him. The pendulum. So he's got to have it broken so he's completely freed. It's broken in many, many places.
Right.
And then he can just slither out.
He can't react too soon.
Yeah.
Right? He's got to wait until they finish. He says, I knew that in more than one place it must be already severed. With a more than human resolution, I lay still. He has this thing, he says, they writhed upon my throat, their cold lips sought my own. I was half stifled by their thronging pressure. A disgust for which the world has no name swelled my bosom, and chilled with a deadly clamminess my heart. So that's definitely a rejection of your axioms, I'll tell you that. I mean, that's because, right, I mean, in other words, it would feel like an instinctive behavior would be, you've got to shudder when all of these things are crawling on you and they're eating you, they're eating at you. I mean, he said before, when he would he was trying to wave them away, they would bite him, being bitten by them already. So I think that you ever think about having to escape from some place, and the only way you can do it is like some very high bridge that you have to like those rope bridges, right? That's the only thing you could do, right? Now suppose you're afraid of heights. What would you have to do to do that? You have to do it, but what has to happen?
You have to think about something. Your mind would have to focus on something.
Don't look down.
Not your immediate sense perception.
It's got to be that you have an idea that is going to propel you, which is different. You have to think of yourself in a different way. I mean, it also helps if there's other people, of course, but it's just something to think about, right? Some people have been in those situations. I was in that situation once, and you find out you are less afraid of heights than you think you are. If you think you're in that kind of a situation. But it's not enough sort of to say that. I think what's important here, so that we don't just trivialize it or so what's going on. Our notions of space and time constrain us. And actually, Rachel, I think you might have something to say about that. I mean, not to make a big thing here, but much of these discussions about Euclidean space or Newton's conceptions of space, at the time of Poe, a lot of that stuff is still a major issue. And in fact, in his writings, I'll argue that there are things that we wouldn't agree with that he says, though his conception of Kepler is very important. what I would just like to say about this story otherwise, that it's about the idea of inquiry, that the Inquisition is not just a Spanish Inquisition. See, the story, of course, is what it is. It's a setting, and it's about a person. And we don't even know what the crime is that the person committed. We just know that in some fashion, his mind did not fit with the Inquisition. And we kind of get an idea of his crime by what he does, because we're getting an idea of who he was by what he does. Because if you think, because remember, this is all being told to us, kind of just like descend into the maelstrom afterward, right?
Yeah.
This whole story is, I've been able to sort of vaguely remember portions of this now that I think back to it. And if you go back into the story again, let's just do something which will help, I think. That once we get past all the business on the, the swoon part. I had swooned, but will not say that all of consciousness was lost. What of it there remained, I will not attempt to define or even to describe. Yet all was not lost. In the deepest slumber, no. In delirium, no. In a swoon, no. In death, no. Even in the grave, all is not lost. Else there is no immortality for man. And I would submit that is the, if you will, the model of the, if you wanted to call it a moral for the story, it's that you have to think from the standpoint of immortality. You have a bunch of rats crawl over you. You can't be thinking about your immediate circumstance in a funny way. Obviously you are. It's a pendulum. You're trying to get out of there, and it's going to be seconds before you're going to get cut in half. But you'd have to think outside of that in order to get a solution to that moment. So I think that his what Poe's trying to say to us here, or is saying, is that the Inquisition imposes ways of thinking. He found himself in a dungeon, right? And this is imposed on it, but that the human mind does not have to accept those constraints. And it doesn't have to accept being tortured. Now, obviously, he, at the end of our story, presents us with a solution which the hero doesn't create, right? He survived. That's his solution. But then there is this a loud blast. It's very much like, in one sense, Beethoven's Fidelio.
That's what I was thought. Yeah.
Okay.
As soon as I saw that.
And for that, he has this General LaSalle. I think it'd be interesting. I think we should go look him up. I did look him up. I don't want to say much about it, but I will put it like this. Let's just read it. There was a loud blast as of many trumpets. There was a discordant hum of human voices. Mine will read a little bit differently than yours. There was a harsh grating as of 1,000 thunders. So all of this is sort of biblical, actually, in terms of the way it's speaking. Like the trumpet shall sound and the dead shall be raised, that whole idea. There was a loud blast as of many trumpets. There was a discordant hum of human voices. There was a harsh grating as of 1,000 thunders. The fiery walls rushed back. An outstretched arm caught my own as I fell fainting into the abyss. So this is not achieved. His exit is not achieved by him. It was that of General LaSalle. The Inquisition was in the hands of its enemies. The French army had entered Toledo. Well, how come it's not a soldier? How come it's not somebody that wrote? It's the general, and he does it. And it all happens at once. It's a very short paragraph. The whole story just comes to an end. And it's clearly a metaphor because it couldn't have actually happened. So I think what we're talking about here is that Poe is saying something to us about immortality. He says that he believes that no matter what, there is this other truth that goes beyond the grave. But I think he's also saying that's true in the present moment. I think I want to introduce one last thing here, which is not Poe, but is from Lyndon LaRouche, and this was a project that he proposed in 1981. It was called the International Language Project. Now, before I read that, he begins with this. He says, "Hey, I brought you my bulldozer." The speaker shouted down into the hole. At the bottom of the hole, a sweating man was working diligently with pick and shovel. "I've got no time to fool with bulldozers," the man in the hole shouted back. "I've got to get this artificial pond dug out before the frost sets in." As I have outlined in a new policy paper, since approximately the British/Jesuit assassination of President Abraham Lincoln, what is called Western civilization has been skidding at a generally increasing speed into a new dark age. This is a new dark age in the same principled sense as that of the late 13th and 14th centuries, or the later dark age of the Counter-Reformation from 1525 to 1653. Ostensibly, progress has continued insofar as certain institutions embodying intellectual achievements of the pre-1866 period were not crushed during the last decades of the 19th century. Those institutions have continued to affect progress, although at an ever slower rate. Western civilization has been winding down, however, and it is now about 5 minutes or less before the clock stops. Most of the persons entrapped within this new dark age may have not been aware that it is a dark age. In those persons' ignorance of the essential features of preceding periods of history, the ignorant ones believe that their poorly educated judgment of lessons of their own immediate experience is adequate knowledge of the way in which the world works. They look at the world from the inside of the culture, characteristic of the new dark age, and cannot imagine that the world were ever better or different. Consequently, one finds oneself in a circumstance analogous to that of missionaries working with primitive, superstitious tribes. The ignorant savage knows nothing of real practice outside his culture and views the missionary's culture as an impractical one. Quote, "You will never succeed in becoming our witch doctor with your impractical culture, Reverend," the wise old savage informs the missionary. The great problem of the missionary is to avoid going native. This is a more acute problem for our missionaries, since they themselves were raised as cultural savages. And cultural savagery has the attraction of Gemütlichkeit, or friendly old shoes. The old shoes may stink a bit, but they are definitely comfortable. And then he goes on, and then he proposes a project. He says about language, and I'm not going to try to read all of that, but I want to give you a sense of it. He says, although we are proposing a complete primary and secondary curriculum outline, so he wants to do a thing for the elementary schools and also for high school. We are presently limiting ourselves to completing preliminary features of the language portion of the curriculum. The intersection among poetry, music, geometry, and philology, the study of languages, as the inseparable facets of literate language. So again, to repeat that, he's saying there is a connection between philology, poetry, music, and geometry. And he said, clearly we are not going to adopt as our immediate task, this was 40 years ago, the production of complete new grammar texts and so forth. Rather, our purpose at this moment is to produce guides to the elaboration of such textbooks and curriculum. For example, we might produce in Italy a book which could be entitled How Professional Educators Must Proceed to Redefine a Literate Use of the Italian Language. In such a text, all the principal topics would be defined and illustrated, all to the degree that no literate reader can lack adequate directions for accomplishing the kinds of elaboration proposed. We have the resources to do this quickly in several languages and to bring preliminary efforts to the point that others outside of our ranks can be attracted to furthering this effort. Now, I reference this because when Poe was writing these stories at that time, the battle was to establish a new level of literacy and a new idea about language. And I just want to conclude by reading a letter he wrote, and it doesn't say to whom the letter was written, just uses an initial, B. So I'm going to read the letter, just take into account, it's written to somebody we don't know exactly to whom, and he's referring to this other person. It has been said that a good critique on a poem may be written by one who is no poet himself. This, according to your idea and mine of poetry, I feel to be false. The less poetical the critic, the less just the critique, and the converse. On this account, I would be as much ashamed of the world's good opinion as proud of your own. Now, another than yourself might here observe, Shakespeare is in possession of the world's good opinion, and yet Shakespeare is the greatest of poets. It appears then that the world judges correctly. Why should you be ashamed of their favorable judgment? That's the question. It says, the difficulty lies in the interpretation of the word judgment or opinion. The opinion is the world's truly, but it may be called theirs as a man would call a book his, having bought it. He did not write the book, but it is his. They did not originate the opinion, but it is theirs. A fool, for example, thinks Shakespeare a great poet, yet the fool has never read Shakespeare. But the fool's neighbor, who is a step higher on the Andes of the mind, the mountains, like the Andes Mountains, like the Rocky Mountains of the mind, whose head, that is to say, his more exalted thought, is too far above the fool to be seen or understood, but whose feet, by which I mean his everyday actions, are sufficiently near to be discerned, by means of which that superiority is ascertained, which but for them would never have been discovered. This neighbor asserts that Shakespeare is a great poet, and therefore the fool believes him, and it is henceforth his opinion. This neighbor's own opinion has in like manner been adopted from one above him, and so ascendingly to a few gifted individuals who kneel around the summit, beholding face to face the master spirit who stands upon the pinnacle. Now, yes, it is pretty polemical, but as a point, Poe, when he was writing, was trying to, and was employed for the purpose of trying to elevate and to create something new in America, which was completely distinct from the British. And actually, I should read one last passage from that. Which is this. He said, "You are aware of the great barrier in the path of an American writer. He is read, if at all, in preference to the combined and it says, if he is established. For it is with literature as with law or empire. An established name is an estate in tenure or a throne in possession. Besides, one might suppose that books, like their authors, improve by travel. Their having crossed the sea is with us so great a distinction. Our antiquaries abandon time for distance. Our very fops glance from the binding to the bottom of the title page, where the mystic characters which spell London, Paris, or Genoa are precisely so many letters of recommendation." So he's saying, if you get a book, if it's published across the way, everybody's fine. It doesn't really matter what the contents of what you write is. And so what they were battling for, he and Cooper, Washington Irving as well, and a few others, was the creation of, just like we say with Dvorak's work when he came to America, a great and noble school of literature, and a culture that deserved it. So these stories are being written in that context. They're sort of combat stories to try to elevate and challenge the normal kind of writing and thinking that he found in America. Okay, so that's it for me. Anybody, anything else? You have questions, anything? Okay, so we'll pick it up with something else next week. I have a couple of different ideas, and I just want to see if we might go into Malanta Tauta. That's possible, a little bit more. But we probably will discuss a bit more these literary wars, if I can manage to get the time to do some work on it.
One thing on that might be interesting is this H. Bruce Franklin thing.
Yeah.
Because I was looking into that a little bit, and he wrote a book called War Stars in the 80s, like 88, I think.
Yeah, I haven't read it.
Yeah, I just looked at it, but it seemed to me like
Because I can't hear that now.
potentially some kind of attack on the SCI.
Well, let me say the following, just to, maybe we could take that up. H. Bruce Franklin was mentioned